This is Glenn Healy.
Hi, this is Braden Holtby.
This is Daryl Sutter.
Hi, this is Brian Burke.
This is Jordan Tutu.
This is Keith Morrison.
This is Kelly Rudy.
Hi, this is Scott Hartnell.
Hey, everybody. My name is Theo Fleury.
This is Tim McAuliffe of Sportsnet, and you're listening to the Sean Newman Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast, folks. Happy Monday. Hope the weekend treated you well. We got a great one on tap for you today, but before we get there, let's get to today's episode sponsors. Carly Kloss and the team over at Windsor Plywood, builders of the podcast studio table. For everything wood, these are the guys. You know, deck season, I hate to say it. It's not disappearing, but, August is flying by, which means we're inching, and I hate to say this. Maybe I shouldn't say it, but we're inching slowly past deck season. But if you're still looking to maybe upgrade your deck, stop over and see the team over at Windsor Plywood. They're all stocked up on their Micro Pro Sienna brown treated lumber. So if you got a backyard project on the go, stop in and see the team. If you're looking for some ideas, I suggest hopping on your phone, taking a look at their Instagram page, do a little creep in, and see what they got. Because, man, they got some cool projects they've helped do. And that's, whether we're talking mantles, decks, windows, doors, or sheds, give the team a call, 780-875-9663. Clay Smiley and the team over at Prophet River, update on the new building. Yeah, that's right. They're taking over the old Buckle here in Lloydminster. The concrete is being poured, interior walls and offices are being framed, and the front showroom is being painted. Let's just say things are speeding up along that, and I'm very excited to get in the new place once it's up and functional to see how they've, made it work for them. It's going to be exciting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what the new building is going to be like for them. They specialize, of course, in importing firearms from the United States of America and pride themselves in, doing it all for you, right? You go online, fill out what they need, order your gun. They're going to take care of all the, shall we call it, BS paperwork that you got to do. I don't mean that it's BS, you got to do it. I just mean that we all don't want to do it, right? They make it simple, take care of everything for you. Just go to ProfitRiver.com and check them out today. They are the major retailer of firearms, optics, and accessories serving all of Canada. Trophy Gallery, downtown Lloydminster, is Canada's supplier for glass and crystal awards. Now, obviously, businesses, hey, you're looking for ideas, why not take a look online, trophygallery.ca. You can find some pretty cool ways to, give some things to your employees or have an award or two, and they will do it up. If you're looking for maybe some drinkware, that type of thing, maybe you're looking to get your logo put on some things, man, stop in and see what they're doing. Trophygallery.ca. They can show you just some really cool ideas. The other thing they got going on for all our sports fans is they got jerseys, they got signed memorabilia, and they got some really cool things there that you can't find a whole lot of places else around this area. So why not stop in or visit them at trophygallery.ca. Contact Clint or Dean at Trophy Gallery, downtown Lloydminster. They are Canada's awards store. Jen Gilbert and team for over 45 years, since 1976, the dedicated realtors of Coldwell Banker Cityside Realty have served Lloydminster and the surrounding area. Star Power is what they're providing their clients with 7-day-a-week access, because they know big life decisions are not made during office hours. Amen to that. Coldwell Banker, Cityside Realty, for everything real estate, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Give them a call, 780-875-3343, and they'll help you find that perfect spot. And when you have that perfect spot, you're going to need a mortgage broker. And why not mortgage broker Jill Fisher? Now, obviously, her name says it all. She proudly serves the areas of Lloydminster, Bonnyville, and Cold Lake, and Vermilion. And she looks forward to working with you for all your mortgage needs. And if you're going, why do I need a mortgage broker? Chances are visit her at jfisher.ca or give her a call, 780-872-2914. And she will, let's just say she'll clean up some things that I can't even try to begin to break down here. But you never know whether you're looking to renew your mortgage or you're actually getting into your first house or a new house, getting that your mortgage and your mortgage rate all set up and getting the best rates for you. That's something she can really tackle for you, and she's got a wealth of knowledge, folks, that you can use. So just jfisher.ca, stop in and figure some things out. Just give her a contact. She's going to help guide you through the weeds, so to speak. SNP billboard across from the airport. I got to give a shout out to Read and Write, the team there. Man, they do sharp work. And once again, I always look around the studio and see the frosted window or the wall quote that looks just kick-ass. So give them a call, 306-825-5111 for any outdoor signage, indoor signage for that matter, or if you got a window that you want frosted. That's Read and Write Advertising. Gartner Management is a Lloydminster-based company specializing in all types of rental properties to help meet your needs. And whether you're looking for a small office or a 6,000 square foot commercial space, give Wade Gartner a call today, 780-808-5025. If you're heading into any of these businesses, let them know you heard about them from the podcast, right? Now let's get on to that T-Bar 1, Tale of the Tape. Originally from Grande Prairie, Alberta, he graduated with a degree in journalism where he worked in the United Kingdom and then across Canada for 15 years with the CBC. Currently, he is the CEO of Canadian Western Agribition. I'm talking about Chris Lane. So buckle up. Here we go.
This is Chris Lane, CEO of Canadian Western Agribition, and welcome to the Sean Newman Podcast.
The Sean Newman Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Chris Lane. So first off, thank you, sir, for hopping on and doing this with me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Sean.
Now, we'll get to it at some point along the way on your background with the CBC and how our two paths cross. But for the listener, you just got married yesterday. I don't know what I was. Well, actually, I know exactly what I was doing on day two. I was on a boat out on Lake Minnetonka in Minnesota with my wife, her family, my family, celebrating a second day or the first full day of marriage. And somehow you've convinced your lovely wife to be sitting here with me. First off, congratulations. But what on earth are you doing downstairs in your basement? Shouldn't you be elsewhere enjoying marriage?
Yeah, well, we'll get to that. I appreciate that. I think, we've had a fun couple of days this week, all right. So, we'll take off here tomorrow. And right now, today's the down day. So to, clean up a bit and say our thank yous and maybe grab a nap too. So easy to fit this in.
Was it a late night?
You know what? It feels like it's been a late couple days. So I think, I'm not, 25 anymore. So anytime past 10 o'clock feels pretty late to me.
Well, you're speaking to a man with 3 young kids who I know all about that. It's funny how as you get older, it feels like right around that 8 o'clock, 8:30, the body just, you're like, what is going on? It isn't that late. And the body's like, yeah, it's time to shut it down. So I can feel your pain.
Yeah, I start listening to your body a little more closely these days.
Now, let's give the listener a little bit of your background. You grew up in Grande Prairie, but maybe shed some light on where your travels took you. And, I don't know, as a kid was working for the CBC. How does that fall in your lap? Was that something you always want to do? I mean, obviously you're not with the CBC now. You're with Agribition. You're CEO of Agribition. So give us maybe a little bit of the origin story of Chris Lane and how you get, along your career path.
Yeah, it is. Lots of people sort of see the transition from media to running Agribition as kind of an unlikely jump, but we'll get to it. And it's actually, far less unlikely than I would have thought too. But, as you said, I grew up in Grande Prairie. I was born and raised there. And, I think there's in a place like Grande Prairie, you're lucky enough to be able to see, really a lot of economic drivers of the country happening in one region at a time. So, energy industry is a big part of what Grande Prairie is about. Agriculture is, I would say, even bigger. And then you've got a substantial forestry industry there too. So when I was a kid, my dad worked at the pulp mill in Grande Prairie. Our extended family farmed and still does. And, and later on, my dad started his own company, which really serviced industrial automation. So we were always surrounded by, the forestry, pulp and paper industry, energy industry, all of it. So it was a really unique way, a really unique place to see, what drives, especially Western Canada in terms of values and economy. So it really does create a pretty cool lens, I would say, to grow up in. And then when I turned 18, I went to university in Edmonton. I did a couple of years university there, and like anybody who goes to university, maybe the first couple of years without a real plan, you kind of bop around, spend a little bit of time in the campus bars, probably more so than you needed to.
No, you wouldn't.
Yeah. You just sort of sample life a little bit, right? And so I was doing that, and by the second year, I'd figured out that here's interesting. I was either decided I was going to be a lawyer, so I was going to do a bunch of pre-law work, or I was actually pretty interested in becoming a priest. So I did a little bit of work in theology. I did a little bit of application work into what seminary school would look like, and decided somewhere along those university days that maybe that wasn't my calling. Probably better for the church, better for me.
What if you don't mind me hopping in here, what was it that attracted you to becoming a priest? Like, what was your thought process there, if you don't mind me digging on you a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, I have a keen interest in sort of history and theology, and
Okay.
I spent a lot of time, reading and researching and around things in theology. And grew up in Catholic school, so that was sort of the first base of
Okay.
first touch point in that. Yeah, and so I had at that age, maybe you're discovering a lot about yourself at that age. I sure was, and I chased that down a little bit, as maybe there's something deeper here around faith and theology that I could spend a lot of time focusing on. But there's a big difference between being interested in it and making it your life's work. So when it came down to it, that was actually a pretty wide gap, and so I remain interested in it, but it's sort of bedtime reading, not a vocation for life. So I was actually just bouncing around between these kind of things, and didn't really know what really life was going to have in store for me. And then I remember one time I came home and I was sitting around the kitchen table with my dad, and we were kind of having the conversation around what do you want to do. And I have to give, my parents a lot of credit. I sure didn't have parents that really said or directed you in any kind of mold. Sort of the world was your oyster, and you're gonna fail or succeed based on your own decisions. So I didn't have a lot of push to do one thing or another. And we were just sitting around the kitchen table one day, and we kind of started talking about whether journalism or writing was something that I could do for a career, and did a bit of research on that. And so I did. I ended up applying for journalism school. And in those days, there's not a ton of journalism schools, degree granting schools in Canada, honestly. So there's a couple out east. There's really at that time there was only one really in the west, and that was here in Regina. And there were a couple other programs on the west coast. So I ended up applying and getting into the journalism school in Regina, Saskatchewan. And at that point, nobody in my family had ever been really east Edmonton. So I got a lot of ribbing when I decided to move to Regina. I'd never been here before in my life. There was a family saying that anybody east Edmonton's a Newfoundlander. So I got I got a fair amount of ribbing for getting a different area code there. But yeah, so I came to journalism school here in Regina, and really, I fell in love with Regina as much as I did the profession and the school. So I decided that one day I was gonna live here and make this my home. And journalism school is a certainly interesting process. I mean, like I said, I didn't have a childhood passion to be one thing or the other, except a race car driver. When I was 8 years old, I was pretty sure that's what I was going to be. That didn't pan out. But
did you ever race?
No, I didn't. No, I did a bit of competitive go-karting, but again, that's that was a path that I just not very good at it. So I enjoy it. It's cool. But anyway, so I go to journalism school in Regina. Never been here in my life. Absolutely fall in love with the city, which I think in those days, and even these days, maybe that's a bit of an unusual thing. In Saskatchewan, we send a lot of people out, but certainly in those days, not a lot of people came in with a passion for it. But I don't know, it struck me. I think it's one of those things. It fills a space in your life at a certain time, and I think that's this city is where I sort of learned to be independent, learned to be my own person. And so it's got a lot of good things have come out of the city for me. And through the process of journalism school, you know, you learn the basics around, you know, the maybe the craft of the profession. So, you know, how to shoot, how to edit. If you're doing broadcasts, if you're writing for magazines, that's different. How to interview people, those kind of things. Had some wonderful lecturers, you know, people in the media industry that are, you know, that were top notch, would come and share what they knew with us. And I was lucky enough in journalism school to get a scholarship that was a traveling scholarship. And so immediately after graduation, I actually missed my graduation because I took a job working for a news magazine in London, England. So I packed up my suitcase on my 22nd birthday and moved to London, England for a little bit to work in a news magazine there.
So a guy who had never been east of Edmonton goes to Regina, falls in love with the city, and from there gets the bug and goes across the ocean.
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing that happens to a lot of journalism students, or at least it did with folks I was hanging around with, is we all thought we were going to be war correspondents. So that's sort of the sexy thing everybody wants to do. They want to be the you know, the guy in the, you know, with the Scud missiles flying off behind you in the background. That's kind of the goal. So anywhere I thought was a little sexier than working at a small town paper had my name on it. So I was up for that adventure. In between then, we did a pretty good internship program at that school, and I'd interned at CBC in Calgary. So I had some connections there, and, you know, interning is about as glamorous as it sounds. A lot of answering phones, a lot of filing papers, but I had a pretty good time. But anyway, after graduation, I go to London and I start working and writing and doing some interviews covering Commonwealth issues. Actually, the magazine was essentially a wire service for English-speaking publications in the Commonwealth. So I did a couple cool projects. I covered the Prime Minister's visit to the United Kingdom. I wrote a feature article on modern day piracy. So it was really, you know, diverse. There was a lot of stuff to talk about and really interesting stuff to chase down. So I did that, and then you know, promptly ran out of money less than a year in, but almost a year, I think. And CBC had called in the meantime and said, "Hey, if you are interested in a job back in Calgary, we've got one that we'd like to bring you in for. So think about it." And at that time, the bank account was running low, and I'd had some adventures in England, and I thought,
what did your adventures over in England teach you? When you look back at it, and, you know, you're in a different country with, you know, I mean, English speaking, yes, but you're in a different country, in a different part of the world than everything else. When you look back on that time, or maybe even during that time, I mean, you must have learned an awful lot about yourself, but you're in the beginning of crafting your craft. I mean, you're developing that. What did you learn over on the other side?
I think that was, you know, there's lots of good lessons there. One of the things I learned is that we take for granted, I think, in Canada, or at least I do, is how, you know, how well our infrastructure really works. And we have lots of complaints about our infrastructure that are justified, right? And I'm not talking just about roads and bridges. I'm thinking, you know, specifically, I remember the struggle just trying to get a phone line at my flat in London, and how, you know, here, you phone the phone company, the house is probably pre-wired for one. It's not a big deal. But over there, I think I had to take about a week off of work to just figure out how to manage the British telecom system and where I had to go. And, you know, I and that really struck me as something that we would take for granted as an easy thing that you can do with a couple phone calls, is that's not like that everywhere, even in the first world, even in English speaking places. There's just enough differences in the infrastructure and the way it's all managed that, for me, you know, even the smallest tasks required way more mental energy to get done than I had been used to. So I was exhausted all the time, because it was everything from figuring out, you know, the transportation system to go get groceries to how to feed yourself for a week, which is substantially different than anything that I was used to. And obviously it's not impossible. 17 million people live in that city and do that every day. But for a guy like me, you know, and from where I came from, that seemed like that was a tough road on a few days.
Well, and I mean, I've lived in several different places. When you're cut off from family and friends, and you're left to, you either figure it out or you don't, right? Like you find out a lot about what you're made of because, the easiest things over here, even if they're not that easy, you have the ability to pick up the phone and, well, I mean, you probably did there too, but I mean, it's not like mom and dad can just slide over and help you with the problem, you know what I mean? Or a good friend or whatever else. It's like, well, I'm sitting here and can't get the phone to work. So that's fun, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of things, and my experience in Regina would say the same thing, is that, the minute you're sort of out of, either, driving or traveling distance from your safety net of people, your network of folks, anytime you're geographically that separate where, if things get hard for a minute, you're really on your own about it. I think that builds a lot. I think you really find out who you are and maybe who you want to be. So there's lots of little instances like that in some of the places I've lived, that I think I wouldn't, as difficult as they might have been in the moment, or even as trivial as they might have been in the moment. I don't want anybody to think that, I was hustling the streets of London to get by, but, trivial things that just make you think and make you work a little bit harder than you otherwise would when you don't have that safety net right beside you. I think that, I think that builds a lot.
I think pretty much, I agree, but two, what I would say is I think almost all kids should have to experience that at some point, right? Or adults, young adults, right? At 18 or 19 or 20, whatever it is, you got to get out from under the wing of parental protection and everything else. And if you go somewhere else in the world and see the way of life they have and maybe see some of the challenges they have, it can give you new perspective on everything that we take for granted. Or I have lots of discussions right now, liberals have been in, they're trying to get in for their, I guess we'd call it their third term. And there's a lot of people out west specifically saying, we got to fight harder for what we do have because, I would have argued, well, short of 5 years ago, Chris, that, we have it pretty good here. Like in our country, everything is top notch, as good as it can be in the world. And yet you can't just sit on your hands and watch that all slide away. And I'm sure that can be up for debate on what that exactly means on what we have to do. But if all kids went around, left the nest, so to speak, whether it's to the other side of Canada to see how they interact and how their lives are, because I mean, our country's awfully big and seeing the diversity of it is pretty powerful. But then if you can take that one step further and move to a different country and actually have to interact, and then if you could take it one step further, move to a country with a different language and have to interact all over again, it teaches a lot about what you're made of. It forces you out of your comfort zone, which is always a good thing because it's going to teach you some things. It's going to show you what you are made of. And that is a very confidence building exercise to do.
Yeah, I think so. I agree, Sean. And I think there's, if there's one thing that I really do try to instill in our kids here, it's, there's not a lot of helicopter parenting. I mean, you want to be there to guide and to guard, but I think, you really lose a lot of what life can offer for you if, if you're constantly, not being allowed to maybe fail or learn some things along the way. And I think as parents, we all, are never really going to aim to let disaster befall our kids, but maybe some things it's good to be uncomfortable once in a while and have to figure something out.
I interviewed a lady, Tanya Abbey. She was used to be the youngest woman to ever solo circumnavigate the world on a sailboat. I was like, I forget how long it was. It wasn't a giant sailboat. And at 18, after having spent one summer with her father and like two siblings on a boat, she did not grow up on a boat. Her father basically put her on a boat and said, have fun, we'll see you, whatever. And she couldn't remember, she didn't know how to sail. And I read that story and then I heard her talk about it and I'm like, can you imagine being a parent and having the gumption to send your child out into the deep blue sea on something they don't fully understand, knowing that it'll be like, I mean, obviously it'd be a wild lesson to learn, and you would know, you'd be so confident by the time you got back, as long as you do get back. Can you imagine being the parent? You know, that's the complete, utter opposite of a helicopter parent. It's like, holy Dinah, we're going to do what? Like, cause like to let your kid climb the rock wall, so to speak, at the park when they're 2 years old and want to do it, you're kind of like, well, maybe I should be there. But if they fall, it's only 3 feet and it's fine, right? And here's a guy pushing his daughter out the door to go sail the world.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. And, it's those kind of people that end up writing books about their life. So, there's obviously there's something to be said about, whether you're sort of pushed or whether your parents sort of create the environment for you to come into it on your own and just sort of stand on your own 2 feet and learn your own experiences a bit. And yeah, I have lucky enough to have been able to do quite a bit of that, I think, in my life. And, it's funny you mentioned sailing, and that's one of the things I did in London. Is I'd never sailed a boat, but I decided I was going to learn how to sail. So I signed up for sailing lessons, and that's, I ended up, I think they call it a level 2 Royal Yachtsman, which I think is basically tie a couple knots and come up for air if you fall off the boat. That's the level. But, I think if you have that, your podcast talks about talking to adventurous people. I think if you have even a little bit of adventure in your spirit, you kind of look for those things, right? What's going to make me uncomfortable? What don't I learn, or what don't I know that I can learn here? And, I think, I just think that's a wonderful thing. And as parents, if we can not helicopter and sort of stoke the fires of that adventure in our kids, I think that's the result. Is you get people like, willing to sail around the world, or really just step out of their own backyard a little bit,
or move across to Regina, and from Regina take an opportunity to go to England. Like, I mean, like that's
we all have our scales, right? Whatever your adventure is at the moment,
yeah.
it's we all have our scales.
On a complete side note, have you ever read The Alchemist?
A long time ago, I did. Yeah, I did read that in my first year of university.
I'm literally listening to it on audiobook right now, and it's exactly that. Sorry, it's just kind of like is the perfect, a boy owns is a shepherd and buys a flock of sheep and so that he can travel, and and then begins to see the world and sells the sheep and goes across the ocean and just keeps traveling. And I find it so, I don't know, timely, I guess, that I'm reading it and talking to you, and this is where the conversation goes. So it's always interesting.
I would say wholeheartedly I enjoyed my education, but I would say equally wholeheartedly that I've learned way more traveling and being in situations that I was a bit of an outsider than I would ever learn in a formal education setting. So, I have a lot of time and I have a lot of interest for people who've built their education around doing things and seeing things rather than formally necessarily learning things in a structured environment.
When you say that, where are some of the places you mentioned? England? Where else? I swear I read somewhere, and I can't remember. I was I've been busy the last little bit, and anniversary. You're getting married. Our anniversary of 7 years, so celebrating that. But I think I read somewhere that you worked in PEI. Is that possible, or that you worked in PEI? So
Yeah,
so PEI, England. Where else have you been?
Well, so I lived in PEI for 5 years with CBC.
5 years.
Yeah. Well, more like 4, just about 5. But I mean, that was an experience. We can get into that anytime you want. That's a very unique place. But again, with the kind of jobs that I've had the ability to see and be in some pretty cool places. Agribition alone, I did not expect the Agribition job to be such a kind of a globe-trotting job. But once or twice a year, it's a big part of this job is international market development and market access. So I've had the opportunity to go to Australia, had the opportunity to go to Argentina, Europe, and there's more on that list that's going to come. In my own personal travels, I've been I've been to Europe a few times, seen lots of that country. And I even think there's lots to explore in this country.
No, there's a crazy amount to explore in this country.
Yeah, one of the things I did through COVID was get my private pilot's license and got myself a little airplane. So I've been enjoying seeing places that I have seen before, but from a totally different perspective.
So is the picture of Craven, did you take that then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a solid shot. I didn't catch that in your Twitter feed. I'm as you can tell, I've been creeping on you a little bit. I saw the picture. I'm like, oh, it's a cool picture, Craven. All right, cool. And then now that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's just the perspective changes the minute you're off the ground, obviously, of what you're seeing. But metaphorically, the horizon's just so much bigger too. Like you see how it all connects, especially in a place like Saskatchewan, where you can, the joke about it being so flat and kind of so monotonous. Once you're up at 5,000 feet and you see how the railway connects all these towns and they all connect to each other and how they move around the landscape, for me anyway, it starts to all come together and make a lot more sense about where the water goes and where the railway goes and where the people are and how they move around.
Yeah, you're seeing the big picture. You're getting, the up high view of everything, and it's hard to do when you're sitting in a building in Regina to see the big picture, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right.
What you lit up when I bring up PEI. You worked there for 5 years. You say it's quite the place. How was living in PEI? I got to give you before you answer that question. Back years ago in 2006 when we biked across PEI in a day, and I always laugh. I got across a province in one day, and PEI was it because it's not this giant place. It's a little spot, and that Confederation Bridge, man, you can see it from eons away, or at least it feels like it. What were the stories that you were running and writing about on PEI like?
Well, I could talk about this forever because it was such a different experience for me. I had moved to PEI from Calgary. I'd been in Calgary for 5 years, and it was the middle of the sort of the early 2000s when Calgary was hot, and it was busy and it was growing, and it never slept, and you couldn't pick a more different environment to just. You didn't downshift a gear. You shifted transmissions entirely to go from Calgary in 2006 to Prince Edward Island, and so. I was pretty excited. It was obviously something very different, and as you can tell, that's a bit of a theme. It was out of my comfort zone, and I was happy to go. And again, it's Canadian province. It's everybody speaks the language. They're all versions of you for the most part. It's not on the surface. It's not that different, but living there is you get a sense of just how different things are from what we know in the West. And the first one is honestly the depth of the history of the place, right? There are families that have been, on that little island for 400 years. And when you come out to where we're from, 100 years, a long time out here, right?
Yep.
So the depth of history is a big one. And I think socially, what you see happening is there's not a ton of in and out migration in a place like PEI. So you get, families and family names in certain geographies of that province that are, they're almost like aristocracy of Prince Edward Island. So there are not a lot of secrets on PEI. So if you have one family name and you're from this area, probably everybody knows how you vote. And if you have this family name and you're from this area, everybody knows you vote the other way. And it's not, the politics out there are, they're so establishment politics. Whereas out here, I would say they're a lot more retail. They're a lot more modern, grassroots style politics. But in PEI, what I noticed is that there was a real issue around patronage there, where all the families that voted one way, if your team wasn't in, then you probably didn't get cracked at the best government jobs. But if there was a switch in governments, then there was this cycle of government appointed jobs, everything from high-end jobs to snowplow drivers. And they would switch. They would, sometimes your contract didn't get renewed if your last name wasn't the right name of the guy who was in power. And so you had this and this was this ebb and flow around politics and people, and everybody accepted that's just the way it was. And I think now it's sort of modernized. I don't think it's like that as much as it was, but when I got there, it was right at the tail end of that. And there were these these ways of doing things and way of being that struck me as very different in Canada, because I couldn't have come from a more different place. But when we were just talking about the things that you learn in situations like that about yourself and about others, is it would have been pretty easy, and it was pretty easy to think of yourself as some hotshot Albertan showing up to a place as slow and remote as PEI and thinking, well, these guys are backwards. I can't believe they do this. I'll show them how it's done. But I don't know about you, Sean, but I learned there, that's when it really struck me, is that things operate the way they do in a place for a reason. And that can be as something as grand as, well, these are the founding families and this is how this island operates politically. It just does, because that's how it needs to operate. Or it can be something as simple as, when I got there, the house we bought had an oil stove, like an oil furnace, because there's no natural gas out there. So it was oil furnace. And then had a backup wood furnace. And it was, not uncommon that people would have these two heating systems in their homes. And I thought, what year are we in here? Like, are we really heating this modern home with wood? I said, you know what? Tear it out. I don't want it. It makes the insurance go high. It must have been a leftover from 50 years ago. Well, it didn't take long. The first winter we were there, they get real winters, real snow, like we don't get out here. And the power's never on, because they can't bury any power lines, because it's just the water table's so high. You're in the sandbar in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So none of the power lines are buried, which means they're all subject to the weather, which means the power goes out all the time, which means in the winter, you want a secondary wood-fired heating system. So we had to put the wood stove back in. So
That's a lesson that'll stick with you for the rest of your life. That's
right.
Like, I'm so smart. Nope, I'm an idiot.
Yep,
Whoops.
exactly. Things are the way they are for a reason. So before you start undoing them and untying those knots, best to do a bit of research into what that reason is. Because chances are, if it was a dumb way to do it, they would have figured it out before you got there.
Yeah, that's funny. That's, I always, one of my stupid moments, because I say this over and over again, and I apologize to every listener who's heard this 13 million times, but like, when I was 18, I really thought I had the world by the nuts. And then at 25, I look back at 18 and you kind of get the drift. And then at 30, I looked at 25 and you go, oh, and at 35, where I sit now, I look back at 30 and 25 and everything else. And I just go like, I don't think I'm ever going to figure this out. Like, I'm just, and sometimes you just got to use your ears and listen and sit back and digest it, and then maybe make a decision. And the story that that happened to me was, we had the water run out of our well out at North Lloyd, and in this farmhouse, we had a drilled well, not a bored well. And so, but everybody else had bored wells. And a buddy of mine just said, "Here, call this number. Cost you $500." And just get them to come do a couple test spots. They'll tell you if you got water here and whatever. It'll take like a day, and you'll have it. And I was like, no, man, I'm gonna get them to drill a hole right beside where my water is. I'm gonna have a well in like a week and a half. It's gonna cost a bit more, but not a big deal. There it'll be. And it was like 3 weeks later, I still had no water. I had paid an astronomical amount, still no water, and ended up calling him like, just give me the number. I'll call the guy. He'll come out. And he came out and, oh, you got water right there, and you build a water well. And I'm just like, sometimes you're too smart for your own self, right? But you need to learn those lessons because that's the best teacher right there. That is the best teacher. Nobody else can teach you that lesson but yourself. And sometimes I always throw around the question, Chris, of like, if you could go back right now to yourself in PEI and walk in the door and talk to yourself before you rip it up, like, would you listen to yourself? And lots of times I'm pretty sure I would have told my future self, like, piss off. I know what I'm doing. Like, leave me alone. Like, I'm bullheaded. I got it.
Yeah, I think honestly, one of the greatest blessings about growing older a little bit is, you come across these things in life that knock you down a few pegs, and there's power in humility, right? I think there's to be strong enough to be humble about the things you don't know, and allow other people their space and their expertise. I think that's a powerful thing that actually is a huge advantage as you get older, and you need experiences like that to kind of show you. One of the lessons that I took from my father, that I'm not even sure he really knows that he taught me, but I, like every kid, you help your dad with a project and you screw it up along the way, and you give him the wrong wrench and whatever. But my thing was I could never hold the flashlight right. It was always wrong. It was always pointed at the wrong thing or casting shadows in the wrong way. So, over time, I sort of learned where to stand and how to hold this flashlight. And, it's a saying that I tell myself all the time is, through that experience, holding a flashlight for your dad, what my dad taught me was never stand in someone else's light. And that, you can apply that in any way you want. But when it comes to, it is a bit of a lesson in how to be humble. And, anytime I need to remind myself about my own humility, I'll always come out a better person for it, I've found.
That's it. That's an interesting line. Never stand in someone else's light. Now, you're talking specifically for their area of expertise?
Yeah, I think so. Well, you can apply it in a lot of different ways. I mean, I think some of the greatest things that we can do to help those around us is not, is figure out a way to let them shine. And I think right back to what we were talking about our kids, and maybe not helicopter parenting them. To me, that's the same thing as, let these kids shine a little bit, even if they fall down or whatever. But, even around expertise, there's, like your well story. I don't know how to dig a well. So,
you spur on,
let people who know what they're doing do what they know how to do.
You spur on thoughts of what we're going through right now. COVID, vaccines. We don't need to go into the deep rabbit holes of all of it, but just to bring you up to speed, I'm a guy who criticizes a lot of what's going on and lockdowns and vaccine passports, whether they're coming for us or not. That stuff, to me, I worry about, and I put a lot of time into thinking about it. But in fairness, I'm no doctor, I'm no politician, I'm no medical expert. I'm just an oil field worker who at nighttime does this, and but it worries me as a society of where we're going. But when you say don't stand in someone else's light, it almost, to what I'm doing, need to be careful, engaged at how I approach that situation.
Well, I would say that doesn't, my interpretation of that little life axiom isn't about disengaging where you feel you've got something to add. I think we all have a responsibility. That's how democracy works. And if you have the freedom of expression, best to keep it sharp once in a while, right? But around this whole COVID thing, I just keep reminding myself, I've got my own thoughts and opinions on it too, and they're probably not that different from most people out here. But everybody who's managing this is doing this for the first time, and I would hate for everybody to have a public and diarized itinerary of all the things I screwed up my first time doing anything. So I do try to remember that once in a while, even though we have a right and a responsibility to critique our leaders on things. But I can guarantee you that nobody's going into work in the COVID Central Command trying to screw it up that day. They're all trying to, every decision that gets made, someone's or a group of people are trying to make the right decision. I do have faith in that. I have enough faith in humanity and expertise that people really do, they're not trying to walk in and make it harder.
Yeah, I'll agree with you there. I don't think anyone has ill intent on what they're trying to do. The only difference between, Chris's first day on the job, nobody's watching, everything, is your stumbles don't impact millions of people. right? Like I mean, it might impact, listener Lucy or something who tunes in and, has a bad day because Chris didn't get it right, or reads an article and there's spelling errors. And for some reason that irritates, or, maybe you get something wrong and you have to correct. And by all means, there's some implications of that. The thing I stumble back, and, this is a nice segue into the CBC for that matter, is when you're in something like that, where you're trying to learn and trying to figure it out, because you're absolutely right. This thing is new to everybody. This isn't like, oh, go to science class 10 and I'll tell you about pandemics, and here's what we do, and this is what we, and this is how you I completely agree with that. In saying all that, it is concerning as we sit here in, going into, geez, how long has it been now, Chris? It feels like we're going into closing in on 2 years of this thing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It feels like we're going to be stumbling through the next, winter again. And I really hope that's not the case. But at some point, even if it is your first time through the gambit of trying to figure out a pandemic and everything else, at some point, there has to be a way to navigate this so that the only answer isn't locking us down for another 8 months because we're petrified of people, dying. And that sounds cold and hard, but it's like at some point we have to find a way that isn't just lock everybody down, just lock everybody down, just lock everybody down. And I really hope that's coming, but now it's becoming the vaccine passport, right? They announced federally you're going to have to prove proof, or take a COVID test, or and maybe that should have been there from the start. I'm not sure. Not the vaccine passport, but if you got to travel to the States and got to take a COVID test, maybe we should have been doing that within our own country. I don't know the answer to that. I can argue freedoms and rights and everything else, but I will agree. I don't think anybody's walking to work saying, "Hey, how can I make this worse? Let's screw some people's lives up." I will argue that overall, it is concerning when we go back to the same playbook, or it feels like we do, time in, time out.
Yeah, I would say there's a huge amount of concern if we're not, if we are not getting smarter about it as we go. And I don't know if we are or we aren't, but I don't think we're disagreeing on that at all. And I would, as I said before, we have a responsibility to to hold our leaders accountable to stuff, and we have a responsibility to speak up if it becomes part of the public conversation, which this obviously is. So, I wouldn't suggest that we have an unquestioningly uncritical look at the world we live in all the time. But I do think is that a little bit of humility and ability to let people, flex their expertise a little bit would help. I mean, we see it in agriculture all the time, right? It's one of the great PR battles this industry faces all the time, is that there's a bunch of people out there who don't know a ton of agriculture, criticize agricultural practices all the time. And I would say farmers and ranchers, the one thing they want all the time is just, believe us in that, we know what we're doing when it comes to taking care of the land, because if they didn't, they'd be out of a lifestyle and a job themselves. So, that conversation is, I think it's universal, is that if people are willing to invest their life in learning and practicing something, then at least we should be able to grant them the grace to prove it. And again, it's not to avoid criticism, or not to hold them accountable to it, but yeah, I just think a lot of effort and a lot of time put into some of these things that maybe we don't see all the time,
or that people don't understand how much time is put into it. Because, in truth be told, you're talking about farmers, that's near and dear to me, and obviously to you as well. We see it firsthand all the time, right? When all the attacks come on oil and everything else. Well, where do I live? I live right around all these guys who go to work every single day, and we understand that the environmental impacts and the the amount of change, actually, when you think of the oil industry, Chris, over the last, I don't know, let's call it 2 decades, the last 20 years for sure, the amount of changes in trying to make it as environmentally friendly as possible. And then almost the fact that just how uneducated probably our population, let's just talk about Canada, heck, even Alberta, Saskatchewan, how uneducated we actually are into what all of the oil goes into making for our lives to make us comfortable, to heat our houses, to, from the cars we drive to the phones we use to the, I don't know, the list literally goes on and on and on. And part of that's, is poor management by an industry as a whole, right? Like, I mean, by not bringing the population into the conversation and letting them understand what it all goes to, it's opened up for this like weird attack on, and I'm speaking specifically where we live, right? Like, I mean, Regina wanted to get away from having oil on billboards and you're like, we literally live in that's part of the backbone of where we're from. And to attack that is, I'm not saying we can't, I would say most people would argue we should be continuing to move to better it so that it's cleaner, safer. And if we can move away from it and find an alternative, why not? Right. But until we get there, we can't just like shut everything off and hope things get better. We live in a place that, say PEI experiences true winter. And I got to chuckle about that because I'm sure there's a lot of, Albertans and Saskatchewans that are hearing that and going, man, what is real winter? Because we go through real winter. And to attack the industry that helps us survive that is wild, I guess.
Yeah, and maybe I'm colored by sort of my own experience and where I grew up and kind of the things I believe in, but it's a great example of the luxury in a society like ours to be able to criticize things like energy and agriculture. I have a hard time, I don't know, but I have a hard time believing in countries and economies that have bigger problems than we have, that's a conversation that is dominating like it dominates here. When you think about how privileged that we are to be able to criticize, well, I'm not really sure that's the way I like my food grown, and I'm not really sure that's exactly the way I would want my house heated or my car fueled. That smacks of some privilege to me. So I have a lot of again, a lot of time, energy, and advocacy for both energy and agriculture as backbones of not only this part of the country that we love, but I think of all the things that it allows us to be able to do. It allows us to put our time and energy and effort. One of the things about the Canadian food system, which drives me bananas when I hear critiques around how farmers and ranchers are supplying it, is I don't know that anybody lobbying those criticisms has a full understanding of how safe, how reliable, and how affordable domestic food supply is here. And we wouldn't be there if we didn't have a continual improvement mentality around how we raise our food in this country, and I would say North America too. And energy is the same way. We don't even think about it. The reliability that's in the energy grid that allows us to do what we do, that's a luxury that most of the world doesn't have.
Yeah, I when you bring up food, I was listening to Joe Rogan, and she's been, she wrote a book back in 2015. Not that I've read it, and I honestly, after listening on Joe Rogan, I'm like, I really need to, and I'm gonna absolutely, I will not get her name right, but Yeonmi Park. I hope that's close. She's a girl who escaped North Korea when she was 13. You want to talk about? I think every person on for sure in this country. But if you have access to podcasts, honest God, I think you should look her up and listen to what she talks about, how she went through life for the first, like, for sure 13, if not like 18 years of her life. And her like view on food is like, it almost stresses me out. Like, she talks about living in North Korea where, if you saw a rat, you ate it, right? Like, and the rats are eating the dead, and it's kind of like this vicious, like, you kind of get the idea, right? Every morning you wake up and all your thought is on your next meal, and your next meal is, I don't know, like grasshoppers, whatever they can find, right? Because they had no food. And here we're just, like once your basic necessities are taken care of, we start to have these discussions that really spiral into, and I'm speaking specifically of the agricultural and obviously, a big resource we have where I'm from and in the oil industry, into these things that I don't know. You start pulling those things away. I'd hate to be in a position where a guy has to worry about, I got a young family. Like, how are we going to heat the house? Or where is our next meal coming from? Like, those are things in this lovely country of ours, in this area, we haven't had to worry about in my lifetime.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's easy to maybe take for granted is the wrong term, but it's easy not to even have that entry or conversation as you build your political views or the things that matter to you and how you communicate them. The fact that we don't have to think about too hard meeting bare necessities, and I think that speaks to not everybody in our part of the world has that ability. I'll acknowledge that for sure, but I think the potential to have it is there, and I think. In other parts of the world, in other countries, the potential to have it isn't even there. So, we do have these discussions and these philosophical battles about how we do what we do, and I think it's largely the privilege of where we live to be able to have that discussion.
To switch topics here, I'm curious. You worked for the CBC for 15 years, correct?
Mm-hmm, that's right.
Why the change? From everything that I've heard, you discuss your travels. And, maybe I need to dig a little harder on it, but I haven't heard anything, that was like concerning of like, I just did, like, well, I didn't really want to be out in PEI, or I didn't want to, here and there. And, by all accounts, it sounded like you were moving up the corporate ladder, so to speak, in CBC. So what was it about the career change that was appealing to you?
Well, I guess a couple things. At that stage, and what the things you mentioned were largely true, is that I was, enjoying some more, more input, more the ability to take part in more things at a corporate level, not just a sort of a local newsroom level. Without without shining my own light too much, I'd had the privilege to win a couple of awards along the way, national awards for what I was doing, and I was feeling like, in 15 years, it's not a lifetime, but it was a long enough time for me to do some things that made me feel pretty good about the contribution that I was making. But at the same time, the media landscape was changing so fast, and most of my time was spent around television news. And if you've done any reading on what's happened to television news in the last 10 years, never mind the last 5, is it's a seismic shift in terms of whether the thing can even pay for itself. And the short answer is generally no. People just aren't watching like that. So, I think at CBC, but also every other broadcast outlet was undergoing these massive changes. They couldn't really figure out, how to get in front of it, and was very reactive. And really what was happening is I was becoming a little bit homeless there. The skill set that I had developed and was pretty good at was becoming less and less of a priority and less of demand. And there's, one of the good things I will say about CBC, there's lots of different opportunities to get slotted in or chase something new down. It is a multimedia company. So there's generally something new and exciting on the horizon. But at the same time, I just felt like maybe it was time to look for something that used what I had learned. And here's the funny part in terms of how different the jobs seem, but how similar they actually are, is how can I apply the things that I thought I could bring to the table in a very different way. And as you said, by that time I was living back in Regina. I had fulfilled that promise to myself when I was a student here, is that one day I'm going to find a way to live here. And I'd been living in Regina for a few years at that point. And the Agribition job, it came up, and I knew a couple people in the organization, and when someone first mentioned that maybe I should think about it, I had that same reaction. I'm like, well, what the hell would a television journalist at CBC have to offer something like Agribition? but the more I thought about it and the more I thought, well, okay, in this organization's current history, there are a couple things that maybe I could help out with. And so I thought about that, and I put it together, and it was a bit unnerving because it's, CBC was the only career I'd ever known, really. To do such a different application of the things that I was building as skills was, that's a big leap. But it was exciting too. And I think, as we've talked, maybe one of the themes in my own life here is, if there's an adventure on the horizon, book a ticket, we're going to go. So this was a pretty big adventure. And, here's one thing about Agribition is you have to, it's not going to work if you don't have an honest understanding and respect for the values in the industry of it. And coming from a place like Grande Prairie and having a family connected to agriculture and seeing it out my back window every day, it's a pretty easy thing to be a champion for, I found, for me, in a part of the world in Regina that I had really grown to love. So to be a champion for an industry that I loved in a place that I loved, that was an exciting thing. So I managed to convince a room full of, cowboys, ranchers, that the journalist from CBC was the right guy. And I don't know, you have to.
That had to have been an interesting task, I bet.
Yeah, I probably didn't understand. I probably didn't respect how interesting it was at the moment. I would say one thing about coming from CBC in my experience, you didn't fully understand what the rest of the world thought of you until you're out there. So anyway, you'll have to ask them how it's going, but so far I'm still collecting a paycheck, so I think I'm doing all right.
Well, I'm curious. You get out of CBC, and you do see how the world talks about CBC. That's we've been going for a while, and you knew coming on. It's one of the things I was really interested to talk about, because especially out west, the CBC is viewed from a stance of it's corrupt. It's it's a liberal propaganda machine. And I've sat here and chatted with you now, Chris, for close to an hour, and I don't get the feeling, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I haven't asked the right questions, but I like to think that if it was going to come out, it would come out at some point. But you sit out staring and hearing the things. What are your thoughts on the CBC and whether it's a giant propaganda machine?
Yeah, honestly, working in it, you're not immune to that. Like everybody, you kind of understand generally where the different political views on whether or not the CBC should even exist or not, right? So, there's the segment of population who firmly, and I think, not without their own evidence, would suggest that that's a total waste of taxpayer money. Is that why we're funding a public broadcaster? But then you've got, I would say, an equally large and equally vocal opinion on the other end of that extreme, that says not only should we have a public broadcaster, and it's important to a national identity, every great country has a public broadcaster, is that we should be funding it 10x more than it's getting now. So you've got those two on the extreme, but where most people land is somewhere in the middle, I think, around CBC. I can tell you from my experience, and maybe I wasn't in the right rooms or not smart enough to be in the right rooms, but the idea that it was a propaganda machine is that was not at all, in my experience, how the day-to-day operation went. We would feel we were doing a pretty good job if people on the right side thought that we were shills for the left side, and the people on the left thought we were shills for the right. If you generally had those kind of angry collars balancing out, that was generally you were probably doing the right thing as a journalist. So I think in my experience, where that comes from or where it shows up is not, I can tell you from my own experience is, CBC is not necessarily full of people that have one ideology politically or otherwise. But what does tend to happen, what can tend to happen, is you get at the assignment level, which is the editorial level about what stories we cover and how, is what I noticed is that you get a geographic bias, and this can extend from your local newsrooms all the way up to the national editorial system. Is the news happening where you live becomes the most important. So, for an example, I've worked in newsrooms where lots of the people making editorial decisions lived in, a couple core neighborhoods in the city. And so everything from an editorial lens kind of gets put through that lens. It's the lens they live. It's the lens we live. And so, if something's really important to that section of the city, it almost carries outsized weight in the editorial process. So in a place like Regina, if I'm living in the suburbs, and the biggest thing for me is whether or not I'm going to get my kids into swimming lessons, because that's what all my neighbors are doing. That we're young families. That's the part of the city we live in. But if I'm fighting for that as a news story, in a system where 75% of the other editorial leaders live in a more typically, downtown sort of arts-based neighborhood, and there's a concern whether or not the heritage properties are going to be kept up to the same standards that they should. Like that's where the push and pull would come in my experience. It's not because there was a whole bunch of liberal apologists looking to work for the state media. If there was influence like that, it really came from people's personal lived experiences, I would say, based on where they were from and where they were living, and how news stories came to be. The obvious news stories were covered no matter what, right? So obviously a war or a natural disaster, it's pretty hard to put that through a lens of your neighborhood, but those aren't what sucked up most of the airtime, right? As a producer, as someone whose job it was to make sure there was always enough stories so that you didn't go off the air 15 minutes early. Part of my job was to come up with different things or different takes or different ways that we could cover something. And all media, CBC included, is full of those people. It's their job to, it's their job to assign the stories and decide treatments, and they're all people. How can they not be influenced by the people closest to them and their neighborhoods and where they really truly live?
I'm curious, is it, I hope I asked this the right way. I assume CBC is just like any big corporation. You have top-down directives pushed to, the local leaders, and then the local leaders push it down and whatever, right? Like, in your 15 years, were you allowed to report and talk however you wanted? I mean, within reason, with language and everything else, but attack a story from any which way you wanted? Or was there structure in certain ways, like we just don't go talk about X, and I don't know what X is, but in PEI, you just don't do bad cover stories on person A or whoever else, you know what I mean? Like that type of influence.
Yeah, I know what you're getting at, and I can truly say, Sean, that never happened. There were never ditches. Nobody that I know, or even in my in my existence, by the time I left, I didn't have a small amount of influence on what was happening on a day-to-day editorial basis. If anybody thinks that you get a call from Ottawa and says this topic's off limits, CBC, that never happened. That would never happen.
But do they feed? Sorry, to hop in. I'm trying to work this out in my brain as we go along. You get the major stories, right? Like a war, whatever the major headlines are. Do they come through like a feed to you? Like, here it is. Boom, 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 boom. That's what your stories are. And you go, okay, does anybody want to take the war or the U.S. pulling out of Afghanistan for obvious reasons right now? Oh, yeah, Jim's going to take that. And does somebody want to cover Scott Moe's going to the Rider game? Oh, yeah, okay. And does it get broken down that way, or is it different than that?
No, you're probably closer than you think into how it works. Is generally, and again, I'm speaking from my experience here, and I haven't been there for 5 years, but
yeah,
I think generally the day-to-day news gathering system works the way it always did. And essentially, you've got a smaller group of people first thing in the morning that sort of goes through basically the headlines of the day. Here's some stories we've been working on that we think might air today. But here's some things that have happened today. Here's some news releases that have come in. And you start putting names and treatments beside these stories, and whether that's a radio file or a web story or a television story in CBC's case. And you sort of, the job entrusted to editorial leaders is build a fulsome and diverse editorial menu of stories that you can deliver throughout the day. And so, and that is at the local level, that is entirely decided at the local level. There's never, in a place like CBC, one of the benefits of being in a network is that, you have a national sort of news gathering ability. And so once a day, the national news gathering system from Toronto would say, here's the list of here's the list of story items that we've built today. If you want someone filing on something from Washington, or you want a story out of Jerusalem, that's it. You can take it if you want. If you don't take it. Nobody ever decided or defined what you had to cover. I would say that's we never experienced that. I certainly never did. I could take or leave those stories in a nightly newscast as I saw fit.
I appreciate you kind of shining light on it. I think, for the regular Joe, a couple things always stick out, right? Like I think it was 2016, and we'll see if I get my years close to it. The government giving the CBC somewhere around $700 million, right? And the criticism of that is obvious, right? Like, I mean, on one hand, it's publicly funded. So in order to keep it going, if they're low on funds, the government has to step in, right? Like, okay. But on the other hand, the government stepping in is like, how can you attack essentially the hand that is essentially keeping your job, if that makes sense? Like, I hope I'm putting that across right. So I think for the common person, they stare at that and go, well, heck, I even stare at it and go, like, how can you possibly write something if you just got a government bailout? I mean, that has to be awfully difficult.
I think optically that, I have that same struggle, Sean, is that, I would say lots of different media organizations have taken that over the years, right? That's whatever you call it, whether it's the local journalism initiative or it's an actual corporate bailout. I think as a taxpaying Canadian now on the other side of this, that's generally not how I would choose my media to be funded on a bailout basis. I think it creates lots of opportunities for that discussion. I think, one thing when I talk about not standing in anybody's light a little bit is that, I've had the privilege to work with and know a lot of people, not only in CBC, but across all different media companies here. And I have a hard time believing that the professionals that I know would let that get in the way of the journalism very easily. So, I do have a bit of faith in the system and the people who have made this their life's work, that the only thing that journalists have is their credibility, which is why they'll defend it so vigorously and why it comes under such critique so vigorously. I'm not, really an apologist or defender for any particular media or CBC for that matter. I'm not there, so that should tell you something. But the people who are, have sort of decided that's what their life's work is going to be. If they're bad at it or feeling like they can't do the basics of the job because of political interference or political funding, they would become bad at it. So I think it would self-select out a little bit. And I think one of the issues that we do have around how we think of our media is that there's a difference, certainly within media, between the people who get paid to be columnists, opinion writers, and the people who get paid to be sort of impartial journalists, however, whatever you think the credibility of an impartial journalist is. And I think what's happening, though, is those two things are coming closer together by design, because when I was in media, it was pretty obvious that it was the opinion pieces where you could give people latitude to maybe poke a fire a little bit. That would get clicks. It would get people. It fires people up, right? I think you have entire radio stations built on opinion journalism, for example. So it resonates, right? It lets people have a voice and have a view, not just a statement of facts. And I think by design, opinion journalism and fact-based reportage, as they would say, reporting, have become far more adjacent. And to my mind, it frustrates me because you can't blame the public then for getting that confused. If CBC, for example, is devoting a lot more time to, personal points of view and essays and opinions, you can't blame people for thinking that the CBC reporting is more opinion based and has more bias, because that's what they're putting on it. And it's difficult, I think, to expect people, if you're not, if you're trying to play in both pools. That's what I would say. And so, I don't know the way out of that, but I think that's what I see happening.
And that's where the confusion is stemming from.
Yeah, I'm people are smart enough to know what they're reading, but I think from a corporate point of view is that it's, they become so next to each other that it's difficult. It becomes harder to separate them. And the people who write it will tell you that's not. They would say that, well, no, clearly we've got a bar on that says that that's an opinion or that's an editorial. And newspapers have been doing that forever, right? The editorial page in a newspaper is different than the reporting you get on the front page. But I just think that you really have as a consuming public of news product.
We're drawn into things that elicit emotion. That's what social media. You can agree or disagree with this, but the rise of social media is clickbait, finding things that just emit a response immediately. And so what newspapers or news in general, CBC is not immune to this, is they've had to give their writers, I assume, more leeway then to write more opinionated articles. Whereas in the past, that wasn't the case. You'd have, like you say, opinion articles versus just reporting the news. And I hope I broke that down the proper way.
Yeah, you're not off base there. I think what's happened in my experience was that, even today you would get, I think, people at CBC who are, there's not a lot left anymore, but beat reporters, right? People who covered specifically sports or specifically politics, or specifically City Hall. There's an effort once in a while to get those people who are very deep on that subject matter as reporters to sort of provide analysis and coverage, and analysis gets really even closer to opinion. And, there are some that will say, no, I'm not doing that. Actually, that muddies the waters too much. Is that it's a difficult thing for me to report on my beat objectively if once a week people are also getting an analysis piece out of me. So, or an opinion piece out of me. And I would say like the media sphere, is served well from keeping analysis, opinion, and fact-based reporting all in the product offering. But the danger to me is that you're clouding it a little bit when they get too close together. And even people in media, like I said, would say that's a bit too close for me.
With the federal election being announced, I got to go back then to what Vance Crow's question on Twitter was. And what are your thoughts on journalists having to disclose who they're voting for? Do you like that? Do you hate that? You're like, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole, or it kind of makes sense, or what's your thoughts?
No, I don't. I think that is that's a real fundamental part of our democracy is your ability to vote for whoever you want, and it's up to you as an individual to decide whether or not you're going to declare that. And I think there's pretty fundamental pieces around again, everybody's got their own opinion on how objective the news media is, but if you're starting to declare who you're voting for, it will only stoke that fire, not help it. And I think as engaged citizens, in my experience, reporters and journalists are probably one of the most reliable set of voters that you could ask for, because they're generally engaged in the world around them so much. I would have to really ask, what does it matter? What are we getting out of that?
Well, I would counter with, if you understood when you read an article, a critical piece of O'Toole or Trudeau or whoever, and I use those two because obviously conservatives and liberals are the two big juggernauts in the federal landscape. If you knew a criticism of O'Toole was coming from a liberal voting journalist, now on one hand you could argue, what does it matter what he's voting? On the other hand, you could say, well, it's a bias, and maybe he's writing the critical piece because he wants. We honestly just went through the American election, and I don't love to stray into different countries' elections, but the U.S., as we all know, they're the superpower on the planet, or one of them, and to watch how their analysts dissected the candidates, it was really, shall we say, troubling, because if they just said, listen, I'm pro Biden and this is why, I think I would have had more respect for it than them bashing on Trump but not explaining some of the stuff they did. Now, to hop back to our conversation, I think it would be, you read or watch a piece on whether it's, once again, I'm using O'Toole and Trudeau. If you knew where the guy was coming from, or woman, then you could at least go, okay, they've acknowledged they have a bias, but this is why it doesn't matter, and you carry on. And I could see why that'd be really beneficial. I could. But
well, I'll challenge you on this. Let's
Okay.
play that movie to the end.
Okay.
Say we do that. Let's say we can agree that, sure, I'll buy the argument on that. Where do you think that would lead us in being able to read or consume anything that doesn't already align with where we exist on the political spectrum? We already have this problem where we have become so polarized that we're generally unwilling to give a lot of time to someone who might.
That's right. Yeah.
So, what do you think that would do to the national conversation?
Nothing. Well, I would say nothing worse that isn't already happening. But maybe I'm wrong on that, Chris. And by all means, I'll agree with you. We listen to people that we agree with their thought process, because it confirms what we're thinking or something along that lines. And I can understand how you don't want to read an opinion by a liberal, just a liberal, get it out of here. I don't want to read what they have to write. But I also think trust is something that is earned and quickly fades, like really quickly. And if you had my trust from the beginning and you just told me the way it was and explained why, and just left all the cards on the table, I feel like that might foster the ability to listen to people instead of always wondering if there's a hidden agenda at all times. Well, I wonder which way because everybody always critiques the other side all the time. So maybe that wouldn't change anything.
Doesn't that simplify it a bit? Like if the only agenda is how you vote, that seems awfully simple to me. Like, I think there's a lot of nuance in there for people too, is that, the way you view the world and issue by issue might not actually fit neatly in whatever party platform of the day is out there. So, if the idea is that you would expose, whoever's authoring whatever piece of media you're reading based on where they vote politically, you've almost reduced anything that anybody has to say to their party affiliation.
That's a good point.
I just think I think the conversations that we need to have in this country are more complicated sometimes than what color a tie the leader you're voting for is wearing on election day. And I think we're so far down the road of a polarizing echo chamber style media environment, thanks in no small part to social media, that the idea that journalists would have to declare their party affiliation, that's far more communist Russia to me than sort of than the argument that you would be making, that we'd be finally free to understand where everybody's coming from. Like even in the Conservative Party, Sean, a vote for a Conservative candidate in the West is very different than a vote for a Conservative candidate in PEI. So, how would a journalist, revealing their Conservative vote necessarily, help someone understand where they're coming from? That's what I was talking about, the geographic bias that exists. No matter who you vote for, I can tell you the idea of government subsidies, and support for things like seasonal fisheries workers is a very different level of support than it is in Western Canada in PEI. And I would say, even though you'd get two people that would identify as Conservative voters, for example, between Grande Prairie and Cardigan, PEI,
They're voting for two different things entirely.
Very different, and they would have, in entirely different views on that.
So then I'll shift to this, because, the reason I bring the question up is Vance had brought it up, and I was like, oh, that's an interesting thought, right? Like if you showed everybody your bias at the start, then everybody can understand, oh, there's a bias and carry on, right? Like, so much of this podcast, my podcast has a bias to where I want to lead it, which means wherever it goes, that's where the audience has to follow if they want to follow along. They don't have to, but they have to follow along with my bias. So by announcing the bias, if that makes sense, I just assume that
you've cleared the decks, you've got it out of the way.
That's right. And I don't mean that all of a sudden now you just become a blue tie and a red tie. I mean, every issue in Canada, there is a lot of complexity to it. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the vote, it simplifies into what party you're voting for and what they stand for. And it very much simplifies everything. That's all I was getting at.
So I would also challenge you on this is so when you vote, when you cast your vote for your candidate and the party, is it an implicit endorsement of everything that party stands for in its platform?
Yeah, definitely not.
So that's a difficult thing to apply to someone's written work as a journalist also, is that even if you did declare what your most recent vote was, at a federal level or provincial level, your city hall level, we've got to factor all that in. Are we assuming then that is an endorsement of everything wherever that check mark lands? And if they wrote something one year when they voted for Liberal and the next year they switched their vote to Conservative, where do we think that lands? I understand the desire. I understand what we're talking about here is an idea to sort of clean up public trust in media, right? Let people trust it more, because I think what we can agree on is it's eroded, right? That's what we're doing. We don't believe it like we used to believe it. Maybe that's part of the problem, and maybe that's a bit of the attack on the expertise, right back to our conversation an hour ago. But I think we have to make sure that when we're talking about what issue we're talking about, and so I am all for trying to find a way, whether that's lifting the curtain, whether that it's transparency. I personally don't have a ton of time for media bailouts in business, but all these things that hurt the public's ability to believe the media the way it did. That idea around public trust is not just a media issue. The term public trust is a strong one in agriculture right now. So I think it's an industry-wide thing. It's a North America-wide thing. We have this erosion of public trust in our institutions, in our industries, and the people that are leading them. And so we have to be really introspective and ask ourselves, well, how did we get there? It probably wasn't because whether or not you're a farmer or a journalist that that your work has become so colored by your politics that it's unbelievable anymore. Probably what's happened is a more nuanced and more complicated erosion of that in society. That's a big topic.
It leads me to a conversation I've had behind I don't know if I've had it on the podcast. I may have had it on the podcast. I don't know. And I'll see what your thoughts are, because you're a man who's been across Canada, worked in different provinces and so on. And you actually paint the picture very nicely that, if you're a conservative in PEI, a conservative in Alberta, are they voting for the same thing? No, they're not. They're in two different worlds. I've had people say, and we got the Maverick Party out west, right? That started up, that is going to promote Western ideals, is not going to run across Canada, is going to stick to its area and promote this and fight for this. And I've had discussions with different people saying Canada is so big and so diverse, we will never, ever agree, because we're just so big and diverse that at some point, whether it's in our lifetime or years into the future, something like a Western separation, or I don't know if separation is the exact where it would go, but it's just to have the ability to be more independent and focus on our needs, and the East could focus on their needs. Do you see then something like that as being beneficial or possible, or something that would be worthwhile for Canada?
Well, I'm, I feel
That's a big question. I understand it's a big question.
Be having some beers over this stuff, but I guess as a
well, I tell you what, the next time you're in Lloydminster, we'll have you in and we'll sit and have a couple beers.
Good deal. I think the more, when these parties come and go, because they've both come and gone in Canadian history, is clearly that they're reacting to people aren't feeling that the traditional outlets are an effective voice for them. I think that's a really important part of democracy. I think, that you get into political tactics and strategy at the high level around vote splitting and lots of worries around that. But at the grassroots level, it's important to be able to have the ability to come up with a new party and a new voice that represents something that isn't being represented. I mean, isn't that the ultimate engagement in democracy? Is that if we don't feel like, there's a system that reflects things that are important to us in our space and in our time, that we can create that. And I think, so I would never discourage, a diversity of voices in the political landscape. I think, again, I keep hitting on this thing that there's a whole ton of nuance in my experience in this country. And one of the things that being a Westerner, being a proud Westerner, is that a common theme is that sometimes we have a hard time with our voice at the table. I think sometimes we have a hard time figuring out how to express it in a way that lands well at the table too. And that's what all this, I think, whether it was Reform Party or social credits in Alberta or Maverick, what we're not is we're not afraid to speak up if we think we've got something to say. And I think our struggle or our frustration is that it doesn't always make it all the way to the rooms we think it should be.
Yeah, that our voice isn't as loud here, but maybe doesn't carry a little further.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's, your preamble to this topic is very true, is the geographic space. And, if you overlaid a country like Canada in Europe, you'd probably get like 15 or 20 different countries with very different, goals.
Cultural goal. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We have that diversity here in Canada, but as a confederation, it's in a system that makes it pretty hard to be cohesive. So I think, for me, I've kind of learned to love the incohesiveness of it. I think I just made up a word, but the fact that what makes the West work and makes the West important is something that's hard to translate in other parts of the country sometimes, no matter how well we think other people should understand it. That's been one of the benefits of being able to live across this country. I think people on the East Coast would feel the same thing about their region. And really, that's the struggle of the Confederacy of a country this large and diverse. But I think it, and my little plug for you here, Sean, is that I think it's really important to have outlets like what you're doing here. I think it's important to have a voice in a new media landscape that allows us to have these discussions, in maybe a larger context, in a more productive context. There's not a lot of sense just being frustrated and mad about a lot of things. I think what we have been able to do, thanks to outlets like this, is become a more serious voice at a table around some of the things in Western Canada that need to be national topics of conversation that sometimes aren't.
Well, I appreciate that. I think like a lot of things. It's a learning curve, right? Like this podcast has been going for, I think it's about 2.5 years now, and I didn't go to journalist school. Certainly have had my pitfalls and certainly have stumbled along the way. And some people might argue I'm still stumbling right now. I'm not sure, Chris, but I'm enjoying every step. And I certainly enjoy having conversations like this with people who've lived in different spots. Certainly, like I say, the CBC does not have a great name when it comes to journalist integrity, but I mean that specifically for the area I grew up in. Just because people put things to really simple, government bailout, that doesn't look good, right? Like that just, it doesn't help that Trudeau's the guy on the seat and that he's had more scandals in the last 5 years. And if either of us in our current positions had even one breath of any of those, I don't think you'd be sitting where you're at. And I certainly can tell you, I wouldn't be sitting where I'm at, right? And so it's an ever evolving landscape, but I do appreciate you coming on and discussing it with me and being open to some of my questions, because it can't be easy to have me try and pick at a place that you worked for 15 years and certainly you hold in high respect. I mean, you're a guy who made a career out of interviewing and traveling the world and discussing. And I do find the topics very interesting, and I enjoyed your perspective.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thanks, Sean. I would happy to talk about this and whatever you want to talk about anytime. I think the CBC is a tricky thing for folks. It's and in a lot of cases, it doesn't help itself either. I've got plenty of critiques about how it works and how it runs and what it does and the place it can have in communities and things. But I'm so far removed from it now. It's mostly like a anecdotal rather than expertise. But I think what's important though around the CBC is that wherever you think on it is it make it an active part of the conversation. There's a very valid argument out there around whether or not it should even exist, and if it did, is the business model to be funded by the government to compete with private media companies. Like that's a big thing to get your head around, I think, for people who run the CBC and for all of us who consume it or don't. It's not a simple question. It's complicated and sometimes sometimes, like I said, how it exists doesn't help itself, doesn't help its own cause sometimes.
Well, before I let you go, at the end, I always like to do the Curd Master Final Five. It's just five short, long, whatever way you want to go with it, Chris. There's just five questions, and I always start with, you're a guy who got to cover a lot, go a lot of different places. But if you got to sit in my chair and could have anyone to sit across from and pick their brain, who would you take?
Oh man, that's quite a question. Can we come back to that one? Can I think about that one? What's your next question?
You can certainly think about it. My next question is, who did you get to sit with that was thought-provoking?
So I actually had a chance to visit with Henry Kissinger once while I was doing an assignment really early on in my career. And, it wasn't like a formal interview style or anything, but we did happen to be in the same room at the same time and share a bit of conversation. And I thought, in the moment, I thought, this is a guy who's seen and had a hand in a lot of significant events, really pre my time, but things that really shaped sort of the modern Western world. And again, he's a polarizing guy. You can sort of like his legacy or kind of hate what he did. But I think for someone like that, who's as Secretary of State at a very consequential time in American history, I thought, this is a pretty cool thing to be sharing the space with a guy that's clearly had to think about some things that are substantial.
Did he say anything when you were sitting with him that just, not caught you off guard, but made you think?
Well, not specifically, and I think that's what really caught me, is that you could just tell that there was a significant amount of life experience and an ability to think deeply about complicated things that, just in the way that the conversation was going at the table, and that's what struck me, is that, clearly here's someone who's seen and done a lot of things and thought deeply about many different things. So that was a pretty neat experience.
If somebody were to Google Chris Lane and you could look through your history of written articles, is there one where you're like, go back to this one?
Well, I didn't do a ton of writing. My career was TV production pretty quick, but I would go back to one of the first articles that I ever wrote for when I was living in London about piracy, and it was kind of on a lark, and it became quite a well circulated article. Because at that time there was a lot of concern about an uptick in modern pirates off the coast of Sudan, and it was really interesting for me from a personal perspective to start researching something that was like, you couldn't pick a topic or a space that was further away from my experience growing up in Grande Prairie, Alberta, and it really was interesting the way that I was able to learn about all the risks to the modern shipping and supply chain. And that's when I started realizing that the job of a journalist is actually not to be the expert in anything. The job of the journalist is to start finding the people who know the things that can explain it in a way so that people who are also not experts might have a better understanding about the world around them.
That is like a great explanation of a journalist. I think of it as you're going where curiosity takes you. Now, for somebody who worked for a news organization, it's probably a little more like, this is where we need to go, right? We need to explore these topics. But that's exactly what you're doing. You're exploring them, and you're finding the people who can shed some light on what the hell actually is going on. Because for most people, they didn't grow up in the region where there was piracy going on and know exactly how to explain it, right? That doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, back to our other conversation about the difficulty that some journalists find around credibility right now is if they blur that a little bit, if they try to become the expert themselves, that's a dangerous road, because that's really not your job, in my opinion.
How about a book? Are you a guy who reads?
Yeah,
okay. What has been a book that has influenced the way you think?
I would say the book that has probably done more for me that way is The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. I'm a pretty big Hemingway fan. And that one I've probably read 10 times in my life. And I think...
You've read it 10 times?
Yeah.
How long of a book is it?
It's not a very long book. I think, a couple hundred pages.
Okay.
But if... Hemingway writes such in a distinctive manner, and I think he writes the male character really well. So, and it's probably a bit antiquated by today's standards. I don't know if it would be all that politically correct, but that's fine with me. And I think there's a lot about in what Hemingway writes around, I think, how men see the world and how we go through it, and what our responsibilities and obligations and struggles and all that are. And so The Sun Also Rises to me is a fantastic story. It's part travelogue, it's part male introspection, it's part adventure. It's I think a lot about that book, actually.
Dang, now you're gonna make me go read. Okay, well, I ask these questions because I'm always like, and maybe there's a good book I haven't read. Well, I haven't read it. So if you've read it 10 times, dear God, it looks like I know what I'm doing. I mean, it's taken me a long, I said early on that I'm just reading The Alchemist, and it's been on my list for a long time, and I'm enjoying the hell out of it. Like, it's really good. So if you've read something that many times, chances are I'm going to have to dabble, and I'll have to hit you back up. If it isn't good, I'm going to let you know about it. But chances are I won't be disappointed.
People who don't like Hemingway really don't like it. So if it's not a style of writing that strikes you right away, I wouldn't fault you for giving up on it.
Here's a fun one. If you were, Agribition is going to have a celebrity boxing match before one of its events. All right. And in one corner is Chris Lane, and in the other corner is any celebrity of your choosing. Who you taking to square off from?
Oh man, Well, I'm not a very big guy, so whoever it is can't be very big. So otherwise, I just get my ass kicked. You know who I would like to box? Tom Cruise.
Really?
Yep.
You
Yep.
sure he's got a side of crazy in there that, I mean.
I know. I'm not saying I would win, but I think he just seems like the kind of guy, and I like him. I like his movies, but boy, if you could just connect on him, and it seems like sometimes he needs a bit of sense, maybe.
I don't. Tom Cruise is an interesting one because I also too am a fan. I've also seen the clips where you're just like, man, what are you doing? Like, I don't get it. But then I've also seen like the extent. You know what I love about a podcast is like it's uncut. Like, this is uncut. People are gonna get, whether they followed us along this far or not. Is, I got to give a shout out to all my listeners because they always do. They always talk about the ends and whatever else. But what I love about a podcast, it's uncut. You get the conversation. Nothing's edited out. I'm not snipping 2 words of Chris talking about CBC, and then that's going to be the headline. And don't get me wrong, there's going to be a snippet that goes on social media to do exactly what it's supposed to do, promote what we talk about. But Tom Cruise did himself zero favors on things like Oprah, where we all saw him lose his mind about Katie Holmes. And, he's had his moments for sure. But I listened to a couple of his unedited interviews, and he says a lot of smart things in there too, where I'm like, he's actually a really smart guy. Why on earth is he going so like off the deep end at certain points in his life?
Yeah, I think you should have a Scientologist on, and you can ask them that question. You should have a whole thing about Scientology.
Do you think they'd come on?
I'm sure. You're Sean Newman. Of course they'd come on. Why wouldn't they?
I like that. All right. Well, can we go back to the first one? I will take your suggestion of Scientology. I'll see what I can do with that. And who would you sit down with? Have you thought anyone?
Yeah, I think, honestly, I'm a pretty big fan of American history and the culture and sort of, modern politics in America. I think George W. Bush, that's who I would pick. Yeah. I actually, honestly, I think he got I think he got a reputation that he probably didn't deserve in his presidency, as being simple and being, and maybe some of that was politically expedient. Maybe that was some of the image that they figured that he needed to be cast in to be able to be as populist as he was. But I have a feeling that George W. Bush is a lot smarter and a lot more reasonable than I think some of the unfair characterizations of him. So I would sit down with him. I think we'd have a good chat.
That'd be interesting. You ever pull that off, make sure you're recording, all right?
Sure.
Well, I appreciate you coming and sitting with me tonight, Chris. Go back to your wife and enjoy being married and everything else. And once again, thanks for hopping on.
You bet. We'll see you at Agribition, right?
When is that?
November 22nd. We're doing it.
Well, as long as they haven't forced us to not be able to travel, the 5 hours from here to Regina. Yeah, I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Great. We'll see you then.
Sounds good.
See you, Sean.
One thing. Hey, folks. Thanks for joining us today. If you just stumbled on the show, please click subscribe. Then scroll to the bottom and rate and leave a review. I promise it helps. Remember, every Monday and Wednesday, we will have a new guest sitting down to share their story. The Sean Newman Podcast is available for free on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever else you get your podcast fix. Until next time.